This is Theology on the Go, a brief interview about an eternal truth.
But there's nothing ordinary about this story. I mean, Job is the most exalted man on earth, and then he experienced the greatest degree of suffering any human ever did to that point, and then he is exalted to twice the status at the end. And all of that in answer to Satan, right, in chapters 1 and 2. So it is a precursor or a foretaste, a picture of the gospel where a blameless and upright man is humbled, to the point of death and then exalted after that.
Hello and welcome to Theology on the Go. My name is Jonathan Master. I'm joined, as always, by my friend and co-host James Dolezal. James, how are you today?
I'm well. Glad to be here and discussing a favorite book of the Bible, I think, for many people, because it stands out in many unique ways. But looking forward to talking to an author friend today.
Yes, this is a repeat guest for us, Professor C.J. Williams, who is Professor of Old Testament at Reformed Presbyterian Theological Seminary in Pittsburgh. And the book that we want to discuss, we've had him on before to discuss a book with a similar title, but that one was on Lamentations. This book is called The Shadow of Christ in the Book of Job. So C.J., thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much. It's good to see you, man. Thanks for having me on.
CJ, I wanted to start by just talking about the book of Job. James said in his introduction it's a favorite book for many Christians. I think that's no doubt right. But on the other hand, I think many people find it a difficult book, an obscure book, particularly because so much of it is made up of dialogue between Job and these friends of his. So if you could just maybe briefly tell us, what was it that first drew you to study in a kind of in-depth way and even write on this particular book of the Old Testament? You've chosen some books, I have to say, that are sometimes seen as sort of the low points of the Old Testament, Lamentations and now Job.
Yeah, that's a good point, and that's a good question too. Well, the book is a bit enigmatic, and it's probably not the first book that people turn to instinctively for their morning devotions, because it is a book that deals with difficult themes, human suffering, and it's a hard book to read. But I had taught through it very briefly here at the seminary in my wisdom literature class, and I didn't have enough time to get into depth to it. I wanted to get into more depth, and so I did a preaching series on it. I preached about 30 or so sermons through the book. And I just found that going through the book, there were these moments here and there that just pointed us to Christ and the gospel, but they were like breadcrumbs throughout the book, just one here, one there. And I got to the end of the preaching series and I thought, I want to go back and I want to collect up all those breadcrumbs, right? And put them all together and make a loaf, right? Put the whole picture together. And that's what this book is. It's really just, it's a short book. It's not a full commentary on the book of Job. But it just deals with that one question. How do we see Christ in this book? How do we see the gospel in this book? I've learned a lot. Wow, it's been an incredible, eye-opening journey to go through the book of Job. Yeah.
So some of the places that people who know Job a little bit will go to almost reflexively are Job's confidence in a coming Redeemer. And his confidence in even a resurrection, a bodily resurrection. But so those are some of the ones that the breadcrumbs, so to speak, that a lot of people pick up on. But what were some of the ones that you came across as you went through this, looking for the messianic or Christological implications that maybe even surprised you a little bit, or you found particularly striking?
Well, you're right. There's many places where Job speaks about his mediator and his savior, chapter 9, chapter 16, chapter 19. But then there's also places where I see Job reflecting the mediator in a typological role. And the whole structure of the book points us toward that. Job's experience of being this upright and blameless man, the greatest man in the East, and no one like him in the world. God says so in the beginning of the book. And he is cast down to this point of unimaginable suffering, only to be exalted even more at the end of the book. So it's this pattern of experience of being favored by God, and being blameless, being a blameless and upright man, being humbled into the ash heap, and then being exalted again. And that's sort of that trajectory of experience is replicated in other characters in the Old Testament, like Joseph, like David. And it becomes this, I think, pattern of redemptive history where the experience of Christ is reflected in the experience of some of these men, of humiliation leading to exaltation. And that's how Peter summarized the work of Christ, the sufferings of Christ and the glories that would follow. All of the prophets point to that. And I think some of these characters, like Job, point us to that as well. But in that long dialogue that he has with his friends, those chapters that seem to get a little bit overwhelming and even repetitive, it's in Job's description of his suffering, that in this poetry of suffering, that we find him framing his own suffering in terms of the messianic imagery that we know so well from the Psalter. And he uses some exact phrases from, like, for instance, from Psalm 69, very messianic terminology and representation of his suffering. So it's moments like that in the book where you realize that this is no ordinary case of an average believer learning how to cope with hardship by depending on God. It is a book that encourages us in that direction. But there's nothing ordinary about this story. I mean, Job is the most exalted man on earth, and then he experienced the greatest degree of suffering any human ever did to that point, and then he is exalted to twice the status at the end. And all of that in answer to Satan, right, in chapters 1 and 2. So it is a precursor or a foretaste, a picture of the gospel where a blameless and upright man is humbled, to the point of death and then exalted after that.
CJ, is there a way, if we understand Job as a type of Christ, and every type, of course, falls short of exactitude, but as a shadow, is there a way in which we can also understand his interlocutors, whether that's his wife, curse God and die, and he says you speak as one of the foolish women, or Bildad, Zophar, and Eliphaz, or even Elihu? How do we is there a kind of, are they shadows of something as well, that we should be aware of, that have sort of corollaries in Scripture or in our lives?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think absolutely that's true. So Job is said to be blameless and upright, and none like him on the earth. That's how God testifies to his character at the beginning. But then along come his three friends, and they accuse him of hiding great sin, or else he wouldn't be suffering like this. And today have this simplistic view of providence where the righteous always prosper and the wicked always suffer. And so the idea to them of a blameless man suffering hardship is an intolerable one, right? This can't be. But I think it points us toward the gospel, right? A blameless man suffering so grievously points us toward the gospel. And I think they, in their own way, sort of unwittingly play into the typology of Job. Because remember what Christ said. He said that he was numbered among the transgressors. Remember that quote from Isaiah that he brings up in John 15? That was part of his suffering, that the people around him accused him of sin. He wouldn't be suffering like this. He wouldn't be crucified unless he was a sinner. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the role that Job's friends play. Look, you wouldn't be suffering unless you were hiding some great sin. But at the same time, God testifies to his blamelessness. Job testifies to his blamelessness. So this picture of a blameless man suffering, again, is a foretaste, a picture of ultimately God's answer to Satan, how he will answer Satan. That's a key thing in the book. Let me just jump to that. I know I'm just going on here. But
go for it. This is why we have you on.
What's the book all about? In the very beginning, the angelic beings come and they present themselves before God, and Satan, the adversary, comes in among them. And God calls him to account and says, where have you been? And he says, well, I've been wandering the earth to and fro back on the earth. Well, stop right there. That's the question of the book. How is God going to answer this earth-wandering adversary who just claimed his own autonomy? How's God going to answer him? Amazingly, God answers him by saying, have you considered my servant Job? God's answer to Satan is going to be in the form of a picture of a blameless man who suffers and who is exalted. And that's going to be a picture of the gospel in which, the Job's heel is bruised, but Satan is answered definitively, right? And that's going to be a picture of the ultimate answer when the ultimate blameless man suffers and crushes the head of the serpent.
CJ, that's such a helpful point. I want to underscore again what you were saying about his friends, and then that point you just made about Satan. Would you then say that his friends they fundamentally have this kind of small, flattened out view of how life works, but more than that, they fundamentally don't understand the realities of the gospel. They fundamentally don't understand the nature of God's work in salvation.
I believe that's the case. And to be fair, Job wrestles with it too. He wrestles to understand why this is happening to them. And they're all sort of wrestling in the dark because they haven't seen what's transpired in chapters 1 and 2. They're trying to come up with an explanation for this breathtaking suffering of this blameless man. And, Job is grasping for answers too. His friends are grasping for the only answers that they know. But at the same time, the book demonstrates in the nature of his sufferings and some of the things that God and Job both say indicate that there's a much higher reference point for what's happening here. It's not just, oh, this guy is suffering. How do we explain that? God is answering Satan by this picture that will ultimately be fulfilled in Christ. So they don't get it. I don't know that any one of us would have really gotten it so clearly in the moment. Job is just dealing with his suffering. But when we see the book as a whole and understand how it unfolds from beginning to end, we have that benefit of seeing.
But Job at least recognizes that there's something else going on, that it's not as simple as saying a righteous man couldn't possibly suffer in this way. He understands that is in fact what's happening.
Yeah, well, I think so, because when God answers, God's answer is this torrent of rhetorical questions that underscore his power and sovereignty in creation and in providence. And at the end of that, Job confesses, he said, I spoke of things that I did not know. Well, he never challenged God's sovereignty in creation or providence. He was talking about his own suffering. And he's humbled by the thought that here he was interpreting something that he didn't realize had such a higher reference point. So it may be just a glimmer of realization in Job by the end of the book, but I think he did come to realize that this whole drama that unfolded in his life again, had a much greater reference point in terms of the gospel and in terms of the plan of salvation.
And it does. Do you think that also Job does finish with a bit of mystery, at least in his own mind, when he says things too wonderful for me?
Yeah.
But then it doesn't seem like he then turns around and says, but now that you've explained them, they're not so wonderful anymore. I get it. There's a little bit of, I think this, even with regard to the wonder of the gospel, it's still a marvel.
Yeah.
It's still a wonder. It's still the wisdom of God that leaves us sort of stunned that he should undertake these things that we could hardly imagine. Is that Job? I always get the sense of like Job's humbled, but he doesn't.
Yeah.
He's more content.
I think you're exactly right. I think he is very much humbled. And, God's answer has the intended response from Job. He is humbled. His friends are silenced. What they said was not right about God and Job. So I think they all come to a realization that they had been misinterpreting this all along. But you're right, there's still some mystery to it. For sure.
I'm going to push a little bit here, not against, but just into your project. Is it possible for a type in the Old, and I'm taking it that you might be suggesting this is, that a type in the Old Testament like Job could be at once functioning as a type and yet also indicating that he doesn't yet quite understand his own role as a type or of what he is a type?
Yeah. I think you put your finger on it. I wonder how clearly he must have understood what was going on, or even some of the ways that he responded, some of the words that he said. In this book, he compares himself to a king who lost his crown and a king who's lost his glory. In chapter 31, he takes an oath of innocence. And incredibly, he says, if I have sinned like Adam, by hiding my sin in my bosom, then let thistles and thorns grow for me. In other words, he says an amazing thing where he could only be a spokesman for a typological spokesman for Christ in that moment. Yeah, chapter 31 is a bombshell where I don't know if he understood the implications of his words, but he must have. It brought the whole dialogue to a crashing halt. At the end, as soon as he says it, it says the words of Job are ended. His friends shut their mouths. So things like that make me wonder, how much did he really understand that he is part of a bigger drama, and there is typology at play in his experience. Some of the things that he says, I have to believe that he understood, that there was some typological reference point that he understood.
CJ, I want to ask you about Elihu. He's sort of a mysterious figure. Commentators differ on whether he is more like the three friends, but a little bit better, or whether he's has a divine perspective that needs to be seen as a kind of prophetic interlude in the book. So walk us through how you see the role of Elihu in this book.
Well, that's a great question, and I'll describe it, but humbly. I know that better minds than I have disagreed and have a different view on Elihu. But when he comes on the scene, it says his wrath was aroused. All right, so he's angry at Job, and he also continues to accuse Job of sin. In chapter 34, he accuses him of adding rebellion to his sin. So the fact that he agrees with the other three friends, to my mind, puts him in that category of that he is not, that he is also part of Job's challenge, part of Job's testing. One of the key and significant things that he does, and I write about this in my book, he claims to be a spokesman for God or a mediator for God. Now, Job had spoken and longed for his mediator in chapter 9, chapter 16, chapter 19. And here Elihu comes, he accuses Job of sin, and he says, the word in Hebrew is mokia. He's like, you need that, I'm that, right? I'm your spokesman before God. But then his monologue falls flat. No one answers him. God doesn't answer him. Job doesn't answer him. He goes unanswered. I think the way I see Elihu is this, and again, I could be wrong, but this is my current perspective. I think he is the last trick of Satan in this book, because we haven't heard from Satan since chapter 2. These friends come along the scene, accused him of sin, but finally one comes along accusing him of sin and says, let me be your mediator. And Job doesn't buy it. Job doesn't go for it. And I kind of look at Elihu as being maybe in a sense part of Job's temptation, the same way that Peter was part of Christ's temptation. Get behind me, Satan. Satan is not above using a well-meaning friend as an avenue of temptation. And I think that perhaps is one way that we can see Elihu, that he is in that role of Peter, right? Of just suddenly a good friend is now a tempter, right? And that's one way to see it. And that's, again, that's my perspective.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. I mean, the counterpoint, of course, is God doesn't condemn him, and he's not answered, but that could be a positive reflection on what he says. But yeah, these are things that, like you said, many Bible students have disagreed on. Yeah. So now I want to kind of step back and look at the big picture. So at the end, the case that you want readers to understand, to see in the book of Job, really is that there are all these places along the way, kind of dotting the trail throughout the book, where you see pointers forward to Christ. And then if you even take a step back and look at Job himself, even Job himself serves as a pointer to the Messiah to come, and a pointer toward these gospel realities that are made plain in the life and death and resurrection of Jesus.
Absolutely. I think you can see Job as both a prophetic character and a typological character, right? As a prophet, he speaks about Christ. As a type, he reflects him, right? And we see him in these different capacities, like when he's speaking about his Redeemer, he's looking forward to Christ, but then you see him in that role of suffering servant. suffering in his blamelessness, and just other elements of his character and parts of this book play into that image. The book begins and ends with him interceding for others, like first his family and then his friends. And then at the end of the book, his friends have to bring the sacrifice to Job. Only Job can pray for them. God says, I'll accept you if Job is the one who prays because I accept him. And I think that's no peripheral part of the story. It's a picture of intercession refined by suffering, in a sense, right? And there's a lot of priestly imagery in the book of Job, too. There's a chapter in my book called Royal and Priestly Imagery, where Job is cast as either a king or a priest, right, in one of these roles. And so it's just fascinating imagery, and enjoying that together with his suffering and his trials, it really does seem to illumine the personal work of Christ.
Well, CJ, as always, it's great to have you on, and thank you so much for your work. Another just provocative, helpful book, The Shadow of Christ in the Book of Job. So, CJ Williams, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much, my friend.
James, it's always a joy to have CJ on, good friend. And what he does that I think is such a gift to the church, and it's the reason why we commend his book so highly, is he has a way of doing really deep study of a particular Old Testament book. That's his area of expertise, and yet writing these very accessible guides to the book that point you forward to the Christological implications. It's just remarkable how he does this. And so good to see another Shadow of Christ book from C.J. Williams.
Absolutely. This is not the multi-volume Joseph Carroll commentary produced out of decades of sermons.
Right.
A really great which is valuable in its own right, an encyclopedia. But this really gets you into some of the major characters and themes. And even as we discussed toward the end, Elihu, there's a bevy of different interpretations of what to make of him, and he is a bit enigmatic, chapters 32 to 37. But I think even the notion of Job, his stumblings notwithstanding, serving as a type of Christ, one who is in an exalted position, brought low, and then raised up to a higher place, is compelling. And I encourage readers, if you want to just get a better sense of what's going on in the book of Job, but don't want to do a 400-page commentary or a 20-volume commentary, this would be something you could just set next to your Bible and kind of step through the book of Job in a reasonable amount of time, but learn a lot.
Yeah, this book is a little over 100 pages, very accessible. And as you said, the chapters are divided up in ways that are really easy to follow and understand. So if any of you are interested in getting a copy of The Shadow of Christ in the Book of Job, our friends from Crown and Covenant have given us some copies to give away, and you can enter your name and information at placefortruth.org or theologyonthego.org and for the opportunity to win one of those books. Also, if you know someone who might be helped by this episode or other episodes, please pass it along, spread the word. If you can rate and review the podcast, that helps us get the word out as well. And if you're able to donate, you can do that at alliancenet.org or placefortruth.org. And as always, thank you for listening to Theology on the Go, a brief interview about an eternal truth.